From Grandpa's house, Jason said casually. Mom and Dad sold it. My fork stopped halfway to my mouth. What? The dinner table went silent. Mom's eyes snapped toward Jason. We don't need to discuss this tonight. But it was too late. 3 weeks after Grandpa's funeral, I had just learned that the house where I'd spent years helping him after Grandma died, the house I thought was still sitting exactly as he'd left it, was gone. How much? I asked. Dad leaned back like we were discussing a grocery bill. $575,000. My stomach dropped. You sold Grandpa's house for $575,000 without telling me. Mom sighed. Lizzy, please don't make this ugly. I looked at Jason. Minutes earlier, he'd been talking about the renovations he wanted to make to his new place. That was why I'd asked where his down payment came from. Now I knew. Dad folded his napkin beside his plate. The money was divided between your mother, me, and Jason. I stared at him. And my share. Mom answered immediately. You don't need one. I actually thought I'd misheard her. Jason had children, she explained. A mortgage. Responsibilities. I was 29, single, employed, and apparently that meant Grandpa's inheritance had somehow become something they could distribute according to who they thought deserved it. You received things too, Mom added. What things? Your grandfather's watch, those photographs, that old document box. I looked around the table. They had split $575,000 while giving me photographs and a watch, and somehow I was expected to call that fair. Dad's voice hardened. The decision has already been made. Usually, that sentence worked on me. Growing up, Dad spoke and I backed down. Mom decided what was best, and I avoided the fight. But this time, something Grandpa had said weeks before his death came rushing back. We had been sitting together when he suddenly told me, when everyone starts fighting over the house, don't fight them. I'd laughed nervously. What are you talking about? He'd squeezed my hand. Open what I left you. At the time, I thought medication and grief had made him unusually cryptic. Sitting across from my parents now, I understood something chilling. Grandpa had expected this. I pushed my chair back. Mom frowned. Where are you going? Home. Lizzy. I walked out before she could finish. 40 minutes later, I was kneeling on my bedroom floor with Grandpa's document box in front of me. Inside were photographs, old receipts, correspondence, and neatly folded papers. Then I found an envelope I had never noticed before. My name was written across the front. Below it was the name of an estate attorney. I held it in both hands, remembering Grandpa's warning. My parents had already sold the inheritance everyone could see. So why had Grandpa specifically told me to wait until they started fighting over the house before I opened what he left me? By 9 the next morning, I was standing in my parents' kitchen with Grandpa's sealed envelope inside my purse. I hadn't called the attorney yet. First, I wanted one simple answer. Did Grandpa actually want you to sell the house? Dad lowered his coffee mug. Mom stopped wiping the counter. Neither answered. Dad. His expression tightened. Why are you interrogating us? I'm asking what Grandpa wanted. We handled his affairs, Mom cut in. We were the ones dealing with everything near the end. We made the decision that was best for the family. That wasn't an answer. Then show me the estate paperwork. Mom stared at me. The paperwork. The documents giving you authority over the house. I want to see them. Her face changed. No. One word. Immediate, firm. Dad pushed his chair back. Lizzy, you're taking this too far. They had sold Grandpa's house without telling me, divided $575,000 without me, and somehow asking to see the paperwork was taking things too far. For the first time, a possibility I didn't want to consider entered my mind. Had Grandpa really approved this? Or had my parents hidden something from me? I left without getting an answer. 20 minutes later, Jason called. Mom says you're accusing them of stealing. I asked to see the estate documents. Don't turn an inheritance into a war, Lizzy. I gripped the phone tighter. Easy for you to say, you got part of the money. He went quiet. Then he said something unexpected. They told me you already got something. What? Something separately from Grandpa. Mom said you were provided for another way. I stopped walking. Jason, what exactly did they say I received? I don't know. They never told me. After we hung up, I emptied Grandpa's document box across my dining table. This time, I examined everything. Buried beneath old correspondence was a stack of letters bearing the same company name. Crestwell Industrial Holdings. I recognized it. Grandpa had occasionally mentioned owning some shares in Crestwell. Everyone treated it like one of his old retirement investments, something small he'd bought decades ago and forgotten about. But why were those papers inside the box he specifically left to me? I pulled out the attorney's envelope. I was finished asking my parents for answers they clearly didn't want to give. I dialed the number. Estate office, a woman answered. My name is Lizzy Carter. My grandfather left me an envelope with your firm's information. There was a pause. Then she transferred me. A man came onto the line. Ms. Carter. Yes. Another pause. You're Elizabeth Carter, Robert Carter Sr.'s granddaughter. Yes. I heard movement on the other end. Then his voice shifted away from the phone. Cancel my afternoon appointments. My heart started pounding. A woman nearby asked him something I couldn't hear. His next words came through clearly. Bring out the Carter Trust file. I never made it to the attorney's office that afternoon. Mom moved first. By lunchtime, relatives were calling me. My aunt finally told me why. Your mother wants everyone together tonight. She says there are accusations being made about Grandpa's estate. Accusations. That was how quickly my request to see paperwork had become a family scandal. When I arrived at my parents' house, aunts, uncles, and cousins were already sitting around the living room. Dad didn't waste time. The house was legally sold, he announced. Lizzy has decided that because she didn't receive cash from the sale, someone must have cheated her. Several faces turned toward me. Mom had even placed Grandpa's watch, photographs, and document box on a side table. Her grandfather remembered her, she said. Everyone received different things. I looked at the display. They were using Grandpa's belongings as evidence that $575,000 divided 3 ways was somehow fair. One aunt frowned. Robert, did your father have investments besides the house? Dad answered quickly. Nothing meaningful. I reached into the document box. What about Crestwell Industrial Holdings? Silence. Mom looked at Dad. Dad looked back at her. It lasted barely 2 seconds. But I saw it. Crestwell, he finally said. That was some old investment, probably worthless by now. Probably. Yesterday, my parents had sounded certain about everything Grandpa owned. Now Dad was guessing. A cousin shook his head at me. Lizzy, maybe you should just accept what your grandfather decided. I intend to. Mom's shoulders relaxed. Then I continued. That's why I'm meeting Grandpa's attorney tomorrow morning. Her expression changed instantly. I'm coming with you. No. The room went quiet again. Mom blinked. Excuse me. The appointment is mine. Lizzy, this concerns our family. So did selling Grandpa's house. Nobody invited me to that. Nobody defended me after that. They didn't need to. For once, I wasn't asking permission. I picked up Grandpa's document box and walked outside. The front door opened behind me. Jason followed. Lizzy. I turned. He glanced through the window toward our parents, then lowered his voice. "There's something I didn't tell you yesterday." "What?" When they explained the house money, I asked about Grandpa's other investments. My grip tightened around the box. "What did they say?" "They told me not to ask about his old business holdings. Mom said they weren't relevant." I stared at him. Jason looked back toward the house. Then at me. "Lizzy, I think they knew there was something else." The next morning, I sat across from Grandpa's attorney, expecting him to tell me whether my parents had cheated me out of part of the $575,000. Instead, he opened a thick file and said, "Lizzy, you're asking about the wrong asset." I stared at him. "What does that mean?" He turned the folder toward me. At the top of the first document were the words, "Carter Irrevocable Trust." "Your grandfather owned shares in Crestwell Industrial Holdings," he said. "He acquired them decades ago." I found letters about Crestwell. He nodded. "Then he left you those records intentionally." My eyes dropped to the documents. So the shares were part of his estate. No. That answer stopped me. The attorney explained that years earlier, Grandpa had reorganized his affairs. The Crestwell shares had been transferred into an irrevocable trust, separate from the assets handled through the ordinary estate process. Then he pointed to one line. "Beneficiary, Elizabeth Carter." Me. I looked up. My parents knew. "We'll discuss exactly what your grandfather documented. But what matters right now is that neither your parents nor your brother controls this trust." "What if they try to sell the shares?" "They can't." "Transfer them?" "No." "Divide them?" "No." For days, I had been thinking about what my parents had taken. Suddenly, I was staring at something they had never possessed. The attorney placed several acknowledgement documents in front of me and carefully walked me through them. Grandpa had established everything while legally competent. His decisions had been documented. The trust existed independently of whatever had happened with the house. I signed the papers, acknowledging my beneficiary rights. My phone vibrated. "Mom." I ignored it. It rang again. "Dad." Then again. I silenced it. Seconds later, a text from Jason appeared. "Mom and Dad want everyone at the house tonight. They know you met the attorney." I stared at the screen. Yesterday, that message would have frightened me. Now it didn't. Because my parents could demand meetings, raise their voices, or tell relatives I was selfish. None of that changed the document sitting in front of me. Grandpa had protected something specifically for me, and they couldn't touch it. There was only one thing I still didn't know. What are these shares actually worth? Before the attorney could answer, the office door opened. A financial advisor stepped inside carrying another folder. He sat beside us and placed a valuation report directly in front of me. Then he said, "You should see what your grandfather's shares are worth today." The financial advisor turned the valuation report toward me. For a second, I thought I was reading the number incorrectly. 5.2, I whispered. "Approximately $5.2 million, he said. I looked at Grandpa's attorney. "The shares are worth $5.2 million. He nodded. Grandpa had bought into Crestwell Industrial Holdings decades earlier, when the company was much smaller. Over the years, Crestwell expanded, and the value of his holdings grew with it. But Grandpa hadn't simply left those shares, sitting inside his ordinary estate. He had protected them. The attorney opened another section of the trust file. "Your grandfather left written instructions explaining his decision." I read them slowly. Grandpa knew Mom had spent years prioritizing Jason financially. He knew that if everything passed through channels she could influence, Lizzy would probably be expected to sacrifice her share because Jason had children, a mortgage, and what Mom called greater responsibilities. That was exactly what had happened with the house. So Grandpa had separated the Crestwell shares. The house could move through the ordinary estate process. The shares could not. They belonged to the trust, and I was its sole beneficiary. There was a line in Grandpa's instructions that made me stop. He wrote that I had been the person who kept visiting when there was nothing to gain. I remembered fixing his back fence with him, bringing groceries after Grandma died, sitting at his kitchen table while he told the same stories I had heard 20 times. I had never considered any of it an investment. Grandpa apparently noticed. That evening, I walked into my parents' house carrying copies of the documents. Several of the same relatives from the previous gathering were there. Mom met me before I had even taken off my coat. "What did that attorney tell you?" I didn't answer. I placed the documents on the table. Dad picked them up first. His eyes moved quickly across the opening pages. Then slower. He reached the beneficiary designation. His mouth tightened. Jason stepped beside him. "What is it?" Dad said nothing. Jason took the valuation report. His eyes widened. 5.2 million. The room went silent. Mom grabbed the report. She read the number twice. Then she looked at me. "So this gets divided too, right?" There it was. Not congratulations. Not an apology. A division. "No." Her head snapped up. "What do you mean, no?" Grandpa already divided his estate exactly the way he wanted. Mom's face hardened. "Lizzy, $5.2 million is family money. Nobody needs that much by themselves." I almost laughed. Instead, I looked at the 3 people who had sat across from me days earlier and explained why I deserved nothing from a $575,000 house. Where was that rule when you divided the house? Nobody answered. "You sold it without telling me. You split the money between yourselves and Jason. When I asked about my share, you said I didn't need one." Mom opened her mouth. I continued. "So if $575,000 didn't need to be shared equally because Grandpa's estate could be divided differently, then neither does this." One of the relatives, who had previously told me to accept Grandpa's wishes, lowered her eyes. Dad finally spoke. "You're going to let money destroy this family." "No, I'm going to stop letting this family use money to control me." Jason slowly put the valuation report down. "I need to say something." Everyone looked at him. Mom and Dad told me Lizzy had already been provided for separately. That's why I accepted my share of the house. Mom turned toward him.